So should we start with a bit of a summary from last time, and 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 as a antidote for me talking too much, I would invite Pablo, who who is a major contributor here, uh, that we could a little bit summarize this together. Um, you can even start if you want to.
I can do that.
Yes.
Last session was a classic example of finding a new word for the same thing with subtleties, right? Like
Yes.
how a new wording of the same things we've been talking brings a bit of a shift in potential, I guess. And the word in question is the seed. The seed is let's call it just an element for now. It inherits some of the filter qualities that we've grow fond of. It has a growth quality. It extends, it moves, it changes. Yeah, it creates sort of like, it can create a network structure in a way. And yeah, I guess that's what we can say about the seed. We, at the end of the session, came up with very clear or very provocative wording of XORG as an approach to culture operated as play. So how can we, play culture, I guess.
Yeah, like in some ways, if one uses the crude metaphor of the whatever 2.0, I would put it like 1.2 because it's slightly more modest. But in some ways, it's like the card ideas we were talking about 1.2, and it's also kind of layer filter 1.2. In some ways, the metaphor fails because it's not just it's better kind of a thing. But then again, not all software that is 1.2 is better than the 1.0, so maybe it still applies. But in some ways, like it brings some other structural qualities, but it kind of inherits kind of all the approaches we have been taking. But maybe a practical example like could be good. Like so, if you think of the seed as, or let's start with practical behavior. Like if somebody came up with, I will be repeating my examples. Sorry, Pablo, because I'm boring in this sense. It's this funny quality that it's actually kind of somehow they're almost like islands, like examples you have made, and I've noticed that other people too kind of repeat the examples. Okay, anyway, moving. Like if say there is um, type called watching films, cinema. It can have some subtitle, but it could be titled just like this. And then it says like, then it describes this way of watching films as you're watching a film maybe alone or together, and at points when you feel like it, you freeze frame it, like you pause the film essentially, and then you approach the image a little bit like a tarot card to be. Like you can have this sort of game mechanics, uh, like for example, make move of making a title, which could be the title of the card, or move of framing something, like it's a let's say it's a scene inside a courtyard, and you frame some person there, and then you can have a move of describing, which could be naming that person that is the overwatcher because it happens to be looking this character over the whole courtyard. And by making these moves, the frozen image is kind of forming into a tarot card like thing, um, uh, uh, like like the overwatcher maybe is related to that there is like a row of cards going, and that's the uh, I don't know, the cavalcade of human goods or whatever it becomes. Um, and then, of course, you could save the picture and then continue to watch the film as if the card is laid on the table in front of you that you have just created. And then you can watch in the light of this card the film further. And of course, the making of the card could be influenced and would be probably influenced by what the film was before that, but taking freedoms from it. So from this practice, you would be essentially watching a film while creating, well, several cards. Could be thought of as a deck of cards in and of itself. And this whole practice operation is a seed, but it could be defining culturally like a form of film watching. It could even say, like, this is film watching for me. It doesn't really matter whether it's fiction or actuality, whether others share it. It's kind of neutral on that. It's agnostic towards, but it's merely like bringing the seed in. But now, of course, like, if one could think like, well, those cards then can form a deck, and you could kind of create a seed of film decks, which is like when films are watched in this manner, these decks are formed, and then people share these decks of generated from, I don't know, Apocalypse Now or whatever film, and that becomes its own seed of decks, and then in that seed it could describe, for example, that these are used to watch the film, that some people actually use the decks while watching the film for the first time. They're using others' decks, or they can use a deck from some other film to watch another film, like a different film. Now there is like the seed of the film watching has created this seed of the decks, which can create the seed of reading these cards, etc., etc. And it's a very simple, like a direction at heart. But then if we think about it, like, what if somebody made a seed of text, just text, and it would describe, well, text is the string of words. They could also make a seed of words, but let's leave that for now. Like, the text is a string of words, and it forms these sort of forms like sentences and paragraphs and layers. Now, like in the normal word terms, we just stepped into fiction, but it doesn't really matter. It's agnostic to that. Like, and then it describes, well, paragraphs are like this, and maybe they're described normally, but these layers are like text that are kind of to be read like a layer to text around them. And there could be other forms described there. So what's happening there in all its kind of modesty is kind of redefining text. And you could make seed that has the type of concept, and then define that, well, concept is this thing that is like a being, a creature that lives in a parasitic relation to words, and part of that description could be normal, but there could be also other additions. So essentially, you're kind of being agnostic in this manner. You're reorganizing culture in itself. Like, you're saying essentially everything in culture, not just artworks or works, but even these sort of basic things like how does language work, or how does text work, or how does anything work, is kind of ready for your canvas. You can make it in itself, and like, of course, any seed can produce new seeds, like the example of the film producing these decks or cards, but then somebody makes a variation of that seed of film watching, which is something else than creating cards, or creating cards in a slightly different manner. That's another seed, maybe born out of the first film watching seed, but still different. Like, from all of this, like, simple structuring, like, I think like the key thing is the approach. Like there's almost like this very thin, kind of very modest, but almost like a layer between you and culture at large, or even life at large, that you can that allows you to separate from like how things conventionally are. Like you can suddenly say, oh, language is different, or text is different, or words are different, or film watching is different. Or you can also say like there is now this new form of film watching while there is a normal form. It doesn't really matter. You can do either. Um, and this is kind of like the, let's say, the approach of the game and the play in it. Like, of course, the play then is fed by forming such seeds and giving types to them, which we can detail maybe later. But the key is that this small little layer kind of turns everything in relation playable, mm, uh, and makes everything into agnostic, whether it's fiction or reality, so to speak, or kind of does away with that division. Uh, and then well, okay, maybe that's enough for an example which was already quite long, but hopefully helpful.
I would say maybe as a trying to synthesize what you just said. Like seeds operate as a way to turn things into modular, playable components.
Yes.
Like let's turn film watching into tarot making. That is a seed. Let's plug that into a chess game. Every move we play one of the cards, and then you have the tarot, the film tarot cards during the chess match.
Yes.
And then you can seed that into something else or whatever.
Yeah, and the key thing, like, really being that it kind of nudges you to think like that. Like, okay, like, you can say that normal chess is a seed for this, and that the seed would be describing how chess works. But then there is a seed of a chess game where you play one tarot card on the side of it, and then you allow it to influence how you play. Or you maybe play one card for each side, and then allow it to influence how they play, and then you're in a different interaction. It's kind of that kind of like when everything is made light, it's also light to change these things. It's like suddenly everything is kind of wet clay, and you can stick your finger to it and change what the thing is.
So, do I get you? Because I'm getting a little bit of a different kind of maybe silhouette of what both of you, your Pablo's there, Pekko's there on my screen, what you're describing as the seed. So Pekko, is it correct that you describe the seed to be the act of doing that? And Pablo, you're describing the seed being the thing that you put into another thing. Which of the two is where you're kind of...
That is a good question. Like, I think it's kind of maybe one reason it's kind of like combination. It's the seed is more like the form where the doing can start.
The seeding.
Yeah, kind of like if you have a form that say describes, like enables in the largest sense, like describes this kind of film watching, then you can think of that as a seed. There doesn't have to be strict rules of how the seed describes that, but it's simply kind of enablement that when you get it, you can see, oh, okay, like this is how this plays, like this is how this film watching plays. But then it can say, oh, this is how text plays, or this is how writing plays, or this is how talking plays, or talking version whatever plays. Like,
but so just to get a bit of grip on this thing, what of these things is the seed? Because you introduce that term. So what is how?
It's recursive, like in this sense, like seeds can contain seeds, and like maybe the idea is that the seed is this game. I would put it in quotation marks. Like this approach is the seed containing seeds that can contain seeds in itself. Like um, um, I don't think what uh, the the emphasis is not on that there has to be the seed, and maybe that's merely kind of um, I don't know, like too present by the word the, but more like it's like every one of these seeds creates this possibility of approach of that this kind of play offers.
You mean that something, anything, has been seeded by something that, so to speak, precedes it?
Yeah, and like forming like something like this is creating a seed. Like said, if you form this like film creating cards, film watching creating cards, that is a seed in itself. Like in a sense that it's almost like lying there in waiting, like a seed containing its own genetics that can grow in certain directions. And it's also a seed that if somebody takes it and starts using it, it's like the seed growing and kind of creating a particular plant in itself.
Pablo, do I get it well that there's still this kind of sense of the seed being something, seed or the seed being, or the act of putting a seed or whatever? Is this something that is a kind of introduction from one domain or practice or whatever into another?
I mean, I guess you can do that with seeds, but it's not the defining factor, maybe. But there is an intention there is a modular intention in the seed, but not necessarily it only becomes a seed if you introduce it somewhere else. I guess that's what I want to say. It's not its defining characteristic.
Like in some ways it shares also qualities with, like if you look at how do people define concepts, it's actually a tricky thing. Like there are not really good definitions, or I mean there are good attempts to define a concept, but it's kind of like it's complex because it's so simple, and it's also hard to define because it's so flexible in its form. And this is kind of like you could say that like forming this game in quotation marks, game that forms a layer between all culture, or is kind of doing a trick of replacing a slightly different paradigm in sort of a similar role that a concept is. I mean, I don't think that's the only way to do it, but that's one way to do it, one way to think about it. So in this sense, like the seed has this sort of quality of this sort of simplicity, but like hard to put in one definition in itself, but merely maybe the metaphor of this, like it is a thing that's from which something can grow, and then like in this sense, like a sense like seed holding genetics, and it's a thing that can be the actual start of the growth. Like, oh, I got these, like, yes, you can say like rules or operations, and now I'm growing from the seed, like the film watching or the text. And like if you take this seed of text that it has sentences and paragraphs, but also layers or maybe some other ideas, like as an example, I actually took a kind of a mental exercise of starting to define this sort of text new, and like coming up with different forms, like oh, there is like sentences, paragraphs, but then there's layers, and then I added like creatures of like certain forms become creatures that start moving, and they become the responsibility of the reader to move them as they continue reading the text. Now, I didn't have any detailed rules for that. I could have made those, but I actually thought that already in that form, the description worked. But then, like, there was once again this sort of, I think, a power of this kind of relation is that, like, I can put that as an interface towards all culture and all text. Like, of course, I can write texts, or somebody can write texts that are specifically made for this and describe the creature, but it's also towards like all the text that exists. And suddenly I'm approaching them like if they are like, now I have to find the creatures that I keep on then roaming as I keep on reading. And this is the kind of playfulness, or an example of how it jumps you to the playfulness.
I think I get it.
Great.
Shall we play?
I mean, we could like, I think definitely
How
let's
would we even
try it.
start?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's the poverty of riches. It could start from anywhere. Like we did make actually, like, even though now this is a very general description, we did visit some of the possibilities of, like, this actually benefits from all the things that we have done before. Like, you could have a seed of a type, and you could make a seed into a scene. Like, all these structures that we have can live inside how do you describe a seed in itself. Because it's kind of both organizatory and playable, but also like it doesn't really have to enforce those. That's a possibility. But like you could take, like maybe actually let's have opinions on, because one easy form would be to take something that we know already in culture. I've been using the text as an example, but could be anything, and kind of essentially redefine it or define it as a seed. That could be one approach.
Can we take a text message or some sort of like Twitter message, something that has a constrained nature?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm for that. What about others?
Or a Twitter message just to celebrate or decelerate certain events.
Yeah, like brackets, a D in brackets, celebrate. Yes, like that could also be like, could also be message, and then there are like, subtypes of it, subseeds, because seeds can be recursive, like Twitter and I don't know, chat messages, Telegram, etc. But like, what is the message in this kind of family you're thinking of might be an interesting one.
I'm always up to a very broad kind of concept or definition of a text and writing and language. So I would say that even if it would be like mainly text, it certainly wouldn't have to limit itself as like being understandable English or so on.
I agree. Like, so for this and other ideas, I created, like, in the mirror board, which you all should have access to, but I'll put the link here. Nevertheless, easier to search. And then in the right bottom, there is two frames. One is called the seed, and you don't really have to take care about the first one now, because this is kind of where I put my notes about this idea. but the second one I made like seed playground, because yes, I think like we can use whatever we have right now, and the size of the frame is not meant to be a limit. Just that there is something of a starting point can also be grown. But just the starters, I put like also what is the there is no correct typology, but I'll nevertheless put the seed word there. So I made a starting point of seed message, which could be added to.
Pekko, you might want to share your screen.
This is true. You are right, and I will do it. So this is just seeding the playground, so to speak. I would hesitate because I've talked too much and to not to be over present. I won't describe like into the definition, but I'll make possibilities that could be there. Message is, I'll call this description, not definition. We talked about this, like how in this kind of world every definition is actually description, but that's maybe not important now. But like my first idea is something I want to get rid of, because I thought of like that the message is kind of like a bullet, but I hate the kind of violence of that form. Not just because of its violence, but just because I don't think it quite fits. But I have this sort of vague idea of like describing a text form that has this sort of yes, a packet, but also like packet with the mind of its own. Okay, maybe I'll go this way. Message is particular form of textual virus with a designated target to infect. So this is like I said, it's not the only direction, but it's kind of like intentionally starting to redefine how to think about a message in itself. But to turn it at the same time kind of like I think the quality here is towards the seed, that it's always kind of like this is also the trick between it and concept, is that it always pushes you to define how a thing operates rather than what the thing is. Like it's not a hard rule, but it's like if you look at the definitions of words, but also concepts in dictionaries, whatnot, like there's always this sort of hidden paradigm that they're take the task of defining what the thing is. But what if the basic task is switched to what do you do? Like taking the ghostly question of what is this, which is what every definition answers to, and turning it into what do you do to activate the thing, to make it living. Essentially, what do you do to play the thing or play with the thing? So And this opens up this idea that, okay, to create the message, like it's like you first think of like what is the element I want to infect with. It's also similar to almost like a vaccine. It's like, okay, what is the thing, which could be even something mundane, like a certain timing, but it could be something completely different. And then I'm thinking like, what are the forms of infection around, like how is it enabling its own infection? And that's the kind of direction I'm going with this. But like I said, this is only one direction. Any other ideas? All are welcome.
Just looking at people exchanging messages. One similar type of like mechanic in a sense is kind of I sometimes think that the messages a single message is always broken, and kind of somehow people are trying to repair or fix or grow from there or something like that.
I think your idea is more interesting than mine. Like that immediately opens like the direction. I mean, many directions, but the one that comes to my mind is this sort of messages inherently fragmented, and like it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. At where does it latch onto, like or like maybe multiple places? Like, is it attaching to some earlier messages or earlier talks, or both? Um, and where does it want to kind of latch forward? And then starting from this sort of form of text or other forms that is inherently fragmentary and built that way, that becomes now an interesting direction that is one is kind of capable of. One gives oneself the allowance to create. That's, I think, a key thing. Do you want to add something of that? Because like I said, like I'm of course like intentionally urging people to put things down, especially when their ideas are certainly better than mine.
Sounds like a message with particular set of slots, and yeah, like it's assumed that all messages have slots to be filled, and that they can also attach to other messages. So there's like a jigsaw nature with them.
Yeah, I like that idea. Also, like so what that brings to my mind is like well, like you essentially said, like that, like the fragmentary nature is kind of dependent on slots, and those slots might be already filled, like when the fragment is supporting itself by earlier messages or other text or whatever, or they could be open slots. And then it kind of opens up this idea of like inherently fragmentary, but also slot using way of text, form of text to describe. So that's a possibility.
Compared to these, let's say, social medias, like never-ending discussions that kind of create new and new, or kind of feed itself in a way that that can last for a very long time and become more like this sort of like how to say, style of breaking everything up or something like that. game-wise, it would be kind of cool if those slots and also those connections that Pablo mentioned, if they would be somehow limited or created out of like scarcity or something like that, because then you would kind of be you would also like have a situation where once your kind of resources are exhausted, or you kind of you come up and say that okay, now no need to use any more resources on this, then kind of we could also say that, okay, hey, this kind of being of a discussion or is kind of it's still incomplete, but it's complete in a sense.
That's a really interesting idea as well. Like in a way, you would open as part of it this discussion of when it's filled and how it's filled. Like that kind of pushes a very interesting different pathway towards text or communication. Like still could be images and so on, but like that pathway in itself is interesting because of course it's a new idea that hasn't kind of formulated in my head, but like immediately it's kind of showing that it makes you think about the text differently. And also when you said chains, like in a way, if it's fragments, they can easily form chains, but then you could put like also like operations of unchaining, uh, like how do you like intentionally break chains? Yeah, that's also an interesting direction, but maybe yours was, I think, more interesting one. And there's some like to put to this, like we're like around these ideas. I think just in all simplicity, like coming up with this, like almost the most important thing is almost like this allowance of a thing that we can already do, but almost like a playful allowance that I have the right to go into the middle of culture and define a text form. It can be defined as proposal, but it can be defined as something that I define like it existed in the culture all along, or it has a long history of as a text form. Um, it doesn't really matter. You have all those. You're allowed to do all of those things, or you're able to say like this is a normal text form, but then you try to give it in a form that enables it. Like here, the challenge could be like in terms of creating the seed would to take people into the place that they can play, like they can write these kind of messages. And of course, you don't have to be completist and make the best form of it. Like said earlier, when I was playing around with this and defining text as like creating creatures, like just this idea that you have to spot the creatures, think how they behave, and start like traveling with them along the text. Even that's kind of operative, even though it's super vague. But that might be interesting in its vagueness because then it gives people a lot of freedom. And I might want to describe it more and give examples of creatures. Maybe take Dostoevsky and say, oh, in writings from the cellar, there is this creature forming in this page, as we can see. Whatever, I would have that freedom to define it more, but even the smaller definition could work. So at its heart, it's a right to reorganize culture in a manner that it all becomes playable.
I just probably skipped many steps and added a seed with 2 slots.
Yeah, but that's fine. Like, is it this one that is completely unaware of the upcoming?
Yeah, the underscore is first slot and second slot.
Yeah, and you could even say like that this in itself is form like you could even define it like hijack something existing, like a proverb. You could make a mutation out of proverb. It would be like malverb, maybe, I don't know, like, and then form that as a writing form, which would be this, or aphorisms. But like make a different form of it, and then kind of describe this writing style, which is kind of like aphorisms, but forms this sort of always having the slots in it. And then part of that description of this, whatever one calls it, like aphorisms or something else, is that the reading style is that you read it, then you fill in your mind the slots at least once, but a good reader keeps on changing how they fill the slots, and only after they have gone several rounds, the aphorism is considered to be read. And of course, all this description could be something else. I'm just kind of fleshing out how the seed also can contain its own practice and culture also in this manner, like for example, describing the reading of it.
I mean, you open up a whole huge space of possibilities with this slot structure, which is really interesting. Because then there's the whole space of interpretation of a message, which from the person, from the receiver, from the writer to the receiver, then is completely, I mean, it's a chain that can literally shift meanings and as it jumps.
Exactly. And I think this is also pointing a lot, like in a way, like all of these things are kind of like, it's almost like we were walking on roads, like the culture forms these roads, like the conventions that we have, like texts like this are like recognized streets. But then suddenly somebody brings you chalk and says like you can draw anywhere, like a road. And then that forms interesting lines, and you start following, like Pablo draw this line, and there was some improvisation or kind of walking that road a bit, and then some interesting sights started to appear, because that's not a direction that is normally walked. Like, and you were describing the sights that appear in this direction. And I think that's the power, or part of the power of it, because it allows you to play with whole culture, everything that is in it. It can also utilize culture, like it can reincorporate, recalibrate, reconfigure what culture or particular form of culture is.
The intention of my arrow is to chain those two seed fragments. So whatever is placed in the first slot is also placed in the first slot of the second phrase.
Yeah, you just evolved this writing style / seed, like you already started to develop this sort of culture around it, like and I could make another version where I say like some like there is often two writers. The one creates their original, I'll call them aphorisms for now, it could be other name, and then the other comes and draws lines, and that's just an option, like it could be something else, but that's then forms this sort of or then a style where the writer like creates these forms, both the kind of empty slots and lines, like, and then one style of reading is that you write with a different, like a very washed out color, some of the words in there, and that's kind of forming something in between reader and a writer. It's like you're not saying it contains this word, but you're kind of making possibilities.
I urge others to start filling some of these slots. That might be fun.
I'm actually doing that with color because that also contains the just aforementioned idea. If I do it with something light, let's do orange. I put it underneath. That's a good. So it's for others is the I know it's kind of slippery on all its simplicity, but for anybody who has been silent to kind of to open the question, like, do you get the idea, or is it still eluding, or yes? I guess that's the open question.
It's really fun in my head. I haven't put any words in yet, but I keep thinking of things which are hilarious, even like history related, like, you know, or it's just, I have a lot in my head now that I haven't put down, but it becomes weird as fuck.
Yeah, it's also like if we would start from image, you know, paintings, and suddenly painting is defined differently, like like easy route, of course. In my head, it's like all paintings are defined like tarot cards. Like there's like the interpretation that the observing paintings or being a whatever watcher of paintings is kind of forming the card out of it, or yeah, like, but that's just a like what comes first to my mind. There could be many other possibilities. Yeah, and there could be a culture now that Pablo has opened this sort of slot writing where people, the colors might have certain meanings. Like, you know, like somebody could use yellow to point out, I don't know, uncertainty, or maybe kind of almost like hesitant putting in, like, I kind of like this here, but I also don't like it kind of sense, and another color could mean something else. So there would be this sort of writing upon text between reading and writing, which would have a kind of emotional spectrum language palette of its own, which is an interesting textual idea which comes along this road. But if I ask Martin, Jakub, any comments, questions?
Not at this point.
How do you feel about the direction? Do you have an impression? I know I'm egging for an answer, but if you excuse my egging for an answer. Or Jakub, do you have any comments?
Hey, sorry, I'm just on my way. Because I need to leave for like 10 minutes, so I was just preparing. But I guess for me in my limited sleep deprived capacities right now, it's a bit so related to kind of my normal everyday context, which is these days a bit more like trying to get oriented in how perhaps some basic concepts or building blocks of economies / organizations, like in this more like, let's say, pragmatic or down to earth, boring space of a specific institution. So that's where I am kind of now, let's say, diving. So a lot of my thinking is actually going towards like, oh, so how do economies work? What is the basis of some of the dynamics related to those forms? And so what we are doing here right now, it's a bit hard for me to bridge to those levels. It seems to me it's very conceptual, like kind of creative psychedelic blending, although very specifically structured. But I need to do more work in my mind to start perhaps bridging those levels. Or perhaps I don't need to do it and just get like get this inside me by osmosis. But yeah. So this is just, I guess, a snapshot of my situatedness.
No, it's totally understandable. Like for me, it's partly also because, let's say, my work, quote unquote, is kind of along the lines as you described. Like the last week has been this sort of metaverse economics and what is the addition of this and like these kind of things, which is certainly valid, but it's also like a certain kind of framework. What I've found is, like over the years, is that actually these kind of things, and especially structuring on this level, is generally grounding in a weird way. It's like it creates a sort of like underlying flexibilities. So when you meet a convention, you're always aware that it's a convention, which makes it easier to go out of the box, and often even the practically best might be out of the box in a situation. Like in some ways, like I agree that it's kind of like creates psychedelia, but that's partly also because psychedelia is always outside of convention. Like a psychedelic painting is like it's a human with the head of an animal. That's outside of convention. Therefore, like it's like that's the pattern. But then if you can get there, it's also kind of brings a certain understanding of how culture works. And I'm now speaking culture in the widest sense of possible. Like culture gives us the sense that there is a corporation and there is money and there is euro and dollar, like brings all these presets in a way, pre-configured states of things. but then like understanding of, oh, okay, here's where I can get to reconfigure them and maybe propose reconfigurations. It also ultimately helps you to this like understanding everything as configurations kind of way. So yeah, that's my excuse. Maybe another one is, and I know I'm kind of setting into a salesman point, but anyway, like I think one possibility, I'm not pushing this, but just to open the possibility, is if one would create a game where the game board is the whole of culture. How it plays, it reorganizes culture. And then by reorganizing culture, it makes it playable. It contains simple rules and then examples, like we're forming examples right now, which are simply examples of play out of the infinity of possibilities. But the game can be quite simple, but it forms this sort of a kind of shareable game. I think it's an interesting direction, partly because it does something that is very game-like, and then it does a lot of things that are very unusual for games, because games are often like these aquariums, like here's where the game happens, and everything outside of it is outside of the magic circle, as they're called or thought. Uh, uh, like it actually does almost like the opposite on that. It rather forms itself as almost like a layer or a protocol or a filter. And if you follow its protocol, the whole culture reorganizes. A fiction and reality start behaving differently. Like the types of work start to be reconfigured, like whether they are types of arts or any other cultural forms. And that's kind of like the what the engine of the game or the filter of the game offers. I think it's an interesting direction. Like I said, not pushing it, but as a kind of opening of possibilities for people, it might be an interesting thing.
Yeah, and this is from my side. This by no means was a criticism. It was just kind of relating my actual situatedness. And one more thought that came up actually, and that was the realm or domain of relationships, because like being in a somewhat, or let's say very challenging type of kind of relationship where a lot of different metaphors is coming up for what is happening. So I was thinking, okay, this is because I realized that actually working through some relational stuff is happening through a lot of metaphors, which are opening new ways of relating, I would say. And so the thought came to my mind that actually this could be this thin layer enabling co-shaping of a like partner-like relationship, for example. So in some ways, anyways, so that was my semi-psychedelic association.
And my back association is like I started to think a seed that I called questionary, and it's a type of relation. Like, you know, people have these relation types like friends and acquaintances and significant others. But then there is this relation type called questionary, which I had a vague image of. Like, if I quickly summarize it, it is actually, it's a relation that is formed to open these questions that the others makes the other part of the relation enter. And then describing that relation type as a seed, therefore playable, and enter it into the palette where we have friends and acquaintances, and now we have this new form. Just an idea. Maybe I'll write it down.
Did you say questionary?
It was my very awkward attempt of giving it a name. I don't think it's necessarily a good name, and probably when I'm writing it, I might change it. But it was the first that came to my mind. So I was trying to make it into kind of form like, you know, like there are words like marriage and maybe I'd make it questional. No, that's not. Anyway, I'll come up with a better name, and it's a type to use our type of relation. And come up with a better name later. And then I make the idea that I steal from marriages, the idea that there are originating contracts, like the marriage contract, but here it's detailing the types of questioning states each partner is promising to bring the other.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, it's once again this sort of a drawn road, like, and of course, like in this game of the seed, people could start playing that relation, probably with a better name because it's a bad name. But anyway, and then that could become like the form, like, oh, like we're not friends, we're questionals, whatever it is, like. I call it quents. Quentship. Okay. Good enough. Um, and in this sense, like being structural, this kind of game is in an interesting state because, like, it's first putting you into this filter mode towards all culture. But let's say you start a quentship because you created it, and then every time you meet this person, you're in this quentship if you keep it alive. So in this way, the game is existing. It's not a circle at all. It's existing like a network. Like it could have like actually a long tail long thread that starts from a session of an hour that happens every time you meet this person, and that's I think completely in line with this type of game, uh, which is structurally very different than how games are normally. linear making the alphabets governments. Can you describe a bit this? This seems interesting.
Michael, I think, Mika put Alphabet's mission.
Oh yeah, I was seeing the cursor now, but like
and I added the government's mission, and I added the mouth mission. It's hilarious, but it's true that then it also probably gives you a picture of what comes into your mind first. And so the set of relationships between the two sentences almost. So how come that, like it gives probably a situated perspective of each one's having a contribution, because it's not casual that these words came, this association came. It's pointless to, not pointless, it's very hard to get why and how, where they're coming from. But it certainly gives you an idea of the person perspective, maybe.
I think that also opens this interesting idea, I added to the side because it's sort of a meta comment, but of player skill. So what kind of skills players that would play the seed a lot would develop? And I think you're pointing out already that you're playing and then you're noticing you're doing this when you're playing, like that there is this, what first comes to mind. And of course it comes very much in this kind of form that we are now playing. But that might lead you to then kind of develop your skill maybe to kind of open more associations. And that might be a skill that comes in strengthened through the play. Because like every game usually develops its own skills. Like people become skilled at certain things which bleed over to the rest of the life. Like it can start to make them think differently and so on. So that's an interesting direction or area to think about.
What I found interesting first with Pablo's experiment was that when you do this sort of like, and you are used to doing this in, let's say, all kinds of like school exams or exercises or so on, like filling out the missing spots. But that is what is very interesting also is like you don't need any instructions. People inherently, they do know how to approach kind of this sort of, or they can think it's a generative seed for them, kind of the structure. It kind of encourages action, and a similar way, if you just take one or two different colors and you take some pre-existing text, for instance, and you just like color some words out of it, people also inherently know to look at those colored texts that kind of are highlighted, augmented from the text, and they know to take some sort of like stance towards like doing something with them, for instance, like reading them so that they kind of know that, okay, I can read it like alphabets, but I don't have to, I can put there like, let's say, whatever, like spaceships or so on, and therefore like I almost like think that when we are like laying these sort of like things out here, what we are actually like doing is we are composing some sort of like map where people can kind of like both like linearly and non-linearly like approach these different like locations in the world, kind of so to say, and kind of engage and combine and play with and use their imagination in a way.
Yeah, I agree that, and also like you said, like there are these certain things, like I think there is an interesting quality of this sort of slotness, which like you said, like the empty line, that people know what to do with it. But I think it like there is this sort of like yeah, the best name I could give for it is this sort of slotness that sometimes people can see, like, oh, it's asking me for input in this context, and it comes out in this. We actually talked about this sort of slotness in the last session with Pablo, that it's like in these seeds, like it's easy to see things like at the same time filled or as slots. Like let's say the example of this film watching and making tarot cards out of it. But you could think of the film just as a slot, and you could replace that slot with paintings. It's watching paintings, and now it's a different seed because it treated the film like a slot and filled it with something else. So yeah, it's like it was something that came to fore quite quickly. That like its ability to think about something as filled or as a slot, which then opens up the filling of it. Yeah, it's interesting as a phenomena.
And you could also add qualities to the slot in the sense that what if you had limitations, like, so what if you say, well, yes, the slots are there to input anything, but it needs to be related to something. So almost you push the player to have to think about a specific area or something, or so then you work even more towards filling the slots under the criteria.
Yeah.
That's actually very interesting. Like if you could like, let's say we would have some sort of like token structure. We would have different sort of like tokens that we would actually be using in order to restrict the possibilities that one has, how to kind of manipulate those slots.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also like it's this weird quality. Like when we read normal text, there is almost like this sort of stoniness to it. That this is what the word here is, but what the slotness is a quality that it's almost like there would be this invisible slot that you can fill, like there would be this invisible line underneath that somebody else filled, but you could fill it as well. Like this sort of like almost like underneath there would be these line formats that Pablo has started, and you're seeing the lines underneath the normal text. Yeah, that's an example of the slotness.
And Pablo's been naughty now because he added under the alphabet mission in blue. Now he's changing the words within.
Yeah, yes.
That's massive. Hey, actually, I have to go in just like 2 minutes, but please do. It looks like a lot of fun is about to emerge.
Yeah, and the one like a summarizing thing I could say, and also give room to you and Martin. I mean, I guess we're ending, but just for some time. But the one synopsis is like if you think of the seed a little bit like a protocol, in the sense like what happened when HTTP came. Like it's more like a grammar, and there were no web pages, and then people had awkward ideas of, okay, this is a possibility. The whole thing is potential. Then they made a first awkward web page, and then another web page. This is kind of the state where the seed is. Like it's this possibility, and then people are creating new forms. I'm not saying these are awkward. I'm mostly saying that the pathway towards when a new grammar appears, it's like the first forms are kind of baby steps in a way. But each forms that is created here is kind of imagining the space of what is the expression with that grammar. Just like each new web page forming this, okay, here's my home page and so on, was forming the possibility space of web pages. And there is a similarity here between the seed as kind of behaving like a protocol, just like HTTP behave like a possibility space of web pages. Martin, do you have any last comments?
I'm basically just been listening now. I think I need to do that a bit more, having been away like close to a month. But I will also, I'm just realizing now that I have to just go watch all the last parts that I missed. So I think I'm getting a bit of a grip of where things are at right now. But I now need to run.
No, yeah, don't sweat about it. Like you'll get up to speed. And I think here it's also like we had to take time in the session with Pablo also, because in a way the idea is super simple, but that makes it also kind of hard to understand, because there's actually very little to define. And I think it takes it's more like getting into the almost like how do you take a stance towards, like how do you stand, rather than like lots of instructions. Of course it benefits from some instruction, but it's more the approach than the instruction. So yeah, don't worry about it. Thanks for being here as a presence. And Mikael,
happy to have made it for
yeah.
Since a long time. Okay, yeah. But I need to, there's the people kind of entering points of attention here. Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Okay, now we go.
Hello. Slot filler, you're filling Smart Martin slot. Did you know this is the power that you have, and it's a power that kids are better at using than adults. You know.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
This is a powerful move. I commend
it's a power move indeed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, guys, I'm out. See you soon.
Bye.
Goodbye. Moi.
And Mikael, you had to leave as well. So.
Yeah, I have a bit of situation here as well, so I'm trying to kind of manage it. But see you very soon. Bye bye. Yeah. Thanks for the session.
Thanks. Yeah. I think we can start to kind of summarize, wrap around, or find like closing, tying the knots, so to speak. Any comments?
If anyone watches the session last time, it is mostly me fruitlessly trying to define the seed, trying to extract the essence of the seed, which I am still like, maybe I should just stop in this pursuit of definition and embrace the unknown. But I still feel the seed needs boundaries for me to activate it in a more conscious way, if that makes sense.
I do agree. Like, it's not fruitless to try to define it. It's just like, I really like the kind of if you look at the culture of trying to define a concept and how like important it is, but how awkward and hard it is. Like, it's none of the definitions really stick. All of them are flawed, but they do help. They do contribute to the whole in itself. Like, and then there's a certain similarity here. Like, so I think it's like worthwhile, and this is also why, like, I'm coming up with new metaphors, because metaphors are also definition. Like, if we listen to Nietzsche, essentially all definition starts out metaphoric. Well, it's not that simple, but that's a general gist of certain Nietzsche's take. But yeah, like, it's also like the metaphors are kind of work of trying to help with the definition of this sort of slippery beast that ultimately will escape definition. There is another similar discourse, academic discourse, around trying to define metaphor, which then notes how impossible it seems and how it always escapes it. And there is a similar discourse around the concept of play. And there is a whole book about this, which is called Ambiguity of Play, which is precisely about the impossibility of defining play and how it's important to try it, but you will always fail at it. So yeah, that's that. I think I can see these qualities reflected here. But I do think, like, and in the last session, we actually kind of populated the space a bit, and some of that stuff and the stuff I wrote kind of before the session is in the frame next to it, the frame on the left. It could be kind of more clear because I was mostly making mental notes, but I thought maybe it's useful to move them anyway here. Like, there is this ideas towards the growth and so on, and we had a lot of discussion last time around these possibilities of types of like defining types in seeds, and there are notes on that of the different types, but it's not any kind of like exhaustive definition either, but just maybe some material that would help. And this should maybe be here because it's about the name. So yeah, it's for your entertainment material or for your potentially fertile, but don't sweat about this material too much. But like maybe the general part is like some of the points have already been made, like how it's a filter of culture and reorganizes culture and so on. But those are there as well.
I think what we played today was really fun, and certainly there was something there. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could play next as well the filter quality of the seeds. So almost like playing these filtering limitations, mm-hmm. So that, I don't know how to say it. There's this aspect of grow rather than opening up, the whole possibilities in language where, anything could feel a slot in any sort of domain. If you play the seed as a filter, then you have more of a path of growth towards somewhere rather than opening up a pan full of things. Maybe the filtering quality can limitate this feeling of the slots. And yeah,
I think that is interesting, and it's I think a major quality in itself. Like we could definitely give some focus on that. Like I agree, and there is some where I wrote about the growth. There's an interesting, which could be better described, but just to say like how seeds are kind of like filters, because every seed, when it grows in the environment, it's affected by the environment, and the environment is affected by it. So it behaves like a filter does. Like if you put a red filter on an image, the image turns red, and it's about both affecting each other. But similarly, the seed cannot grow actually at all without the environment, and then it has to kind of form its whatever plant it forms in terms of the environment. So it's affected by it, but also like the seed contains something of its own, like a certain kind of a plant, and then that affects the environment as well. So there's this interesting interplay between growth and filter likeness, but that's just one quality in it.
So like I just came in, so I'm not sure how relevant the question is, but it occurred to me when you were speaking about the seed shaping or affecting the environment and the environment affecting the seed. So it kind of this distinction between like sensors and effectors, that the seed has some kind of sensors or is, and also effectors like affecting the environment. So I guess that's another set of possible lenses.
Yeah, it is.
I do not know where they fit or how, but
I've been collecting on the right side of the playground, like some meta topics that have raised in this play, and I'll put the sensors and effectors here, because you're right. I think it's an interesting direction. It like sensors in itself, like I have actually some thoughts about it, like not to open a can of worms, but I think it's actually a big topic, like also like because the question is then what is sensing, and this is not a critical question, rather I think it's an important question.
Yeah, for me it's a bit like related to when the cells were differentiating into like motoric neurons and sensoric kind of cells coming from one let's say shared undifferentiated thing. So that is another association, but yeah, like for the sensing and affecting.
Yeah. So that's another. And then, so we could think towards the filter qualities, and then like also that sensors and effectors, like still to kind of bring back this sort of, which I think was really present here, is like how much it's kind of behaving like a protocol, even a protocol that is in a draft stage. That this is really much like if, like to use this metaphor of the web page, like if you had like the first forms of composing web pages, and then you're kind of like, oh, we could have this kind of a thing, and you're forming it. But I do think like it also kind of gives this interesting message of how it can be given, or interesting advice on how it could be given to other people. In the sense like it would be simple rules, but it would be a lot in terms of ways to play. And of course, the seeds themselves are ways to play, and then seeing the seeds being used are ways to play. But with just that, you could give the game, maybe with some comments about the sort of how the structure is almost like subtly ever present, like like how it can kind of, because of its kind of subtlety, that it forms really just a layer between us and our culture. It can touch upon anything, and form kind of threads out of there, which is interesting as well. So, but all of that could form already a kind of way of expressing it, expressing the game. But that's kind of my concluding words. If anybody wants to add anything, and especially if anybody has like a good closing, concluding comment, such are very welcome. I could make the conclusion softer by restarting my camera now, but it has to be rebooted again. Shall we end in silence?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm still sort of looking at what we did and just wondering in my mind, sort of. There's certainly something there, you know. It's there's the seed is there, but there's lots of weed now with the seed and the plant. It feels like we need to get the weeds away.
Yeah, we opened a door to a large space, took chalk, drew directions, and pursued it. Like it's precisely that, which is what one should do when one opens a large space of possibilities. Like that's how you start to understand what the space is, because each of these spaces is exotic and unusual. But all right. Thanks. Thanks. And I will now, with that, thanks, say goodbye to the whatever potential people, and stop the recording.